Today, we're looking at China's foreign policy reset as Beijing recalibrates its wolf warrior diplomacy of the past few years. We ask, can China pull off its charm offensive? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Yin Khvat. My guests are Leonard Chao, Adjunct Professor at National Tsing Hua University and former Taiwan Ambassador to the Kingdom of eSwatini, and Wen-ti, lecturer at Australia National University's Australian Centre on China in the World. And earlier, I spoke to Sean King, Park Strategy's Senior Vice President and an affiliated scholar at University of Notre Dame's Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Affairs. He was also a recent visiting fellow to S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies and former US Department of Commerce Senior Advisor for Asia. Ambassador Chao and Wen-ti, very warm welcome to the show today.
Thank you.
We start the programme in Australia. Beijing hopes to restore the trading relationship with Canberra. This is China's ambassador to Australia.
Yeah, what we need now is goodwill, not preconditions. You have a goodwill, you find solutions, and other issues might be solved as well. But if you put other issues ahead of the disputes, you are really making it even more difficult. This by common sense. This is just going to be the case. So I hope that both sides will show goodwill, sincerity, and let's see what we can work it out either multilaterally or bilaterally.
China is lifting sanctions on Australian coal, wine and other exports. The bans had been in place since 2020 when Canberra called for an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. The move comes after Xi Jinping met with Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese in November at the G20 summit in Bali, and Foreign Minister Penny Wong visited Beijing in December. Before 2020, China was the top consumer of coal from Australia, which is the world's biggest exporter, responsible for 30% of global trade in coal. Wen-ti, if I can come to you first. So in terms of China's foreign policy reset, do you see the bilateral relationship with Australia as being, the biggest change?
Yeah, I'll say so. I think there's this saying in Chinese, right? You kill off the chicken to scare off the monkey. So in a sense, a couple of years ago, during the height of the pandemic, China was trying to make an example of Australia. It's one of the leading airline partner of the US, of course, and that I think from China's perspective, they needed to find a high-profile target to make an example of and to demonstrate what would be the prices that other country would have to pay if they pursue policy that's different from Beijing's wishes. So just like China used to make an example of Australia, right now China is trying to make a counter example of Australia by making Australia a little bit of a litmus test, if you will, to show how if China could get even Australia back into a positive relationship with China, then the same would likely go for the other Western countries as well. So, yes.
Ambassador, a litmus test.
Yeah, this obviously, this China's long time, the aggressive and assertive way of handling this foreign policy is about time to be changed, because they have encountered a series of setbacks So
what do you make of his Chao's comments? No preconditions, only goodwill.
Well, China seems to be good at using these terms as preconditions. Obviously, for example,
setting their own preconditions that they don't want preconditions.
That's right. Taiwan and the cross-strait the talks, and China always repeatedly mentioning that if Taiwan can follow certain preconditions, such and such, and then we'll do whatever. But this has been frequently used by the Chinese envoys or officials, so it has not been a surprise.
Right.
But it's about time for them to have a change. Otherwise, that'll be even getting worse.
Wen-ti, how significant is the change?
Yeah, if I may add a little bit more on the so-called no preconditions talk as well. I think China has a specific thing it has in mind, and that's this item called the 14 grievances. 14 grievances. Basically, around 2020, China was unhappy with Australian behavior, so they made a list of 14 items that they're not happy about as far as Australian behavior is concerned. So China was basically insinuating that Australia must change on these items, otherwise there could be no restoration of relationship between China and Australia. Right now, though, the table is turning, and rather Australians saying, unless if China makes changes on economic sanctions, on a changing diplomatic freeze in diplomatic dialogue, as well as releasing a couple of Australians that's been detained in China under controversial circumstances. Otherwise, Australia cannot have a normal relationship with China. So now the preconditions about Australian having precondition on restoration of ties. So it's China's turn to say, oh no, let's not have preconditions, please. Let's just work it out.
I see. So a little bit more than just sort of respect for human rights and transparency, those sorts of preconditions. Ambassador, let's talk about more broadly now. What sort of other indicators do we have that China appears to be reversing its wolf warrior diplomacy?
Well, it's not until recently that the increasing number of Chinese officials and envoys, they have been adopting a certain nationalistic and sometimes belligerent tones in their official statements. What are the purpose for doing that? I think their purpose, obviously, aside from the following the conspiracy of China, also they would like to hopefully they can score points for the boss in Beijing and the netizens across their country, China. But secondly, this kind of this behavior has obviously, although it seems to play well, okay, back home. However, they have caused some it's a controversial because this aggressive behavior it undermines their image and also has hardened the foreign attitudes toward China. So that was it's a reversive, way of doing that, to the traditional goals of diplomacy. Diplomacy is for the purpose of making friends, not to offend your friends, not to infuriate your friends.
One of the things I noticed that the Chinese Foreign Ministry often said is that countries were sort of hyping up the China threat.
That's right.
Yeah.
So this kind of this kind of behavior is a long time for decades, almost for decades, and then this is the wolf warrior, the behavior that has caused some interesting, funny name for their countries, PRC. So they say that PRC has a new interpretation, meaning public relations calamity. So this is about time for them to they have to change somehow and somewhere. And so this time, it will not continue doing that. However, they will not change their core strategy. So I'd like to, if I may, make a polite comment on this foreign policy reset. Well, it's not that much. It's a way of handling foreign policy, a readjustment. So it's a rather, if I may be allowed to be frank, that is rather a cosmetic change. Cosmetic change. The substance remain unchanged. So I say that it's about. So let's not underestimate the Chinese scheming policy. So you might as well say that it's turning soft, but it's turning away, changing from the currently a very aggressive wolf into a scheming fox.
I like that. I like that very much.
So that's it.
Wen-ti, cosmetic, and we're talking about a cosmetic fox, a scheming fox.
Scheming fox.
A scheming fox rather than a wolf warrior. So more cosmetic changes. Do you agree?
I think overall, largely yes. I think China's current, or rather the recent wolf warrior diplomacy style, a lot of it has stemmed from its political power centralization, I believe. When power is centralized, when personnel promotion decisions are centralized, and it depends as much on being in good graces of your superiors rather than your performance on your job as measured by, as Ambassador said, how many friends you make internationally, how many more deals you're able to make. When your performance is measured by personnel, political relations, then it's natural that people will be acting in a way that's more likely to get them onto TV, as well as getting into good graces of their leaders. And that, unfortunately, in their current political climate may mean a harsher style. So whatever change they are showing at the moment, it's hard to see them as anything but temporary and perhaps cosmetic in nature.
So let's talk about what's finally made China decide it needs to make cosmetic changes. Maybe Ambassador.
Well, certain examples have obviously undermined the Chinese image recently, diplomatically, and also I think this is a try and error, a period, obviously, and China has experienced. Well, given the recent some incidents such as the economic downturn, so China used to be a kind of great economy, but not anymore. So China has suffered some recent setbacks, internationally, and at home. So they have to lay low. Okay, China is always they keep changing their way of handling the foreign policy. They used to have a hide and buy. Okay, period a long time ago, hide and buy. You know what it means, yeah. But now not anymore. They like to keep a high profile for the sake of beefing up their international posture. And now it's going too much. They have to come back down. So I think they keep changing. And this time, this kind of a low profile so far, I think someday I won't be surprised it will come back up again sometimes.
Right. Yeah, so really just fluctuations
That's
we're
right.
talking about.
Yeah.
Ambassador, let's move to Taiwan.
Yes.
So this seems to be the one particular relationship, foreign policy relationship, let's call it, where China has actually toughened its stance.
Yeah.
What do you make of the Nikkei's report that Wang Huning has been asked to draft Xi Jinping's so-called unification plan for Taiwan?
Well, unification, as time went by, unification is not anymore, very popular term to all the Taiwanese. Okay, obviously, but as you know, that for the past few decades, China has never stopped. Okay, adopting so-called the carrot and stick. Okay, the pressure over Taiwan, and however, combined, as I mentioned earlier, with the recent Chinese economic downturn, and also the U.S. increased kind of ally shoring efforts. Okay, so international teaming. Okay, so that was
and Japan's defense boost.
So
obviously.
with Japan and recently India. Okay, in Australia still some, but in the Europe, some European countries have beefed up their pressure over China as well. So this kind of new incidents have reduced Beijing's leverage. So they have to change, turn, you see this past few days, some new news, a new development about the China's behavior, with regard to Taiwan's, the businessmen exporting food to China, to mainland. So they have, lifted some certain restrictions of the food boundary. So I think that's one example. But the truth is that this kind of economic carrot can never, change the people of Taiwan's mind. Okay, getting Taiwan to give up, that can attract Taiwanese people to give up the autonomy and freedom they have enjoyed so far. I don't think so. So and this unification has never had a market in Taiwan, and so Taiwan is not going to change its course, whatever the slogan of China might be, and we're going to stay the same, stay where we are, and so the China is they continue, raising their international, their aggressive, behavior about international, higher, more assertive international posture with regard to Taiwan, but it's going nowhere. Yeah.
Okay. Wen-ti, it's going nowhere. Any unification plan for Taiwan, sorry Wang, but it's going nowhere. Do you agree?
It's going to be a tall task for sure, and I think this whole narrative about Wang Huning being tasked with coming out with a new theory on Taiwan unification strategy, I think may be a very partial understanding of how the CCP policy making process works. Because for one, the head of NPPCC, that is Chen Guozhenxie, that Wang Huning is going to be a chairman of.
That's the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference?
Oh, yes. It's a mouthful for sure, yes. I mean,
it rolls off the tongue.
That position does have overall supervision responsibility for the Taiwan policy portfolio for sure. But one thing is policy making CCP at that top level it's done collectively. Usually, for example, when they come out 20-party Congress report, for example, they'll get like hundreds of scholars, think tank officials, put it in a big hotel somewhere in the outskirts of Beijing, brainstorm for a month or two, and then they bring through multiple rounds of revision before they come up with a draft, which then go through multiple rounds of drafting further down the chain of command, for one thing. And second is, I think this story about Wang Huning being the big theorist here who's going to come up with new theory on Taiwan unification is slightly problematic in that, A, I know that he used to be a scholar, so scholar and theorist seem to make sense. But B, the guy is 67 years old, however, and the fact that he's been promoted to China's number 4 with all the daily grind of responsibility, non-stop decision-making, meetings, fire to put out, that's not a position where you can have a clear head and a mental space to come with grand new theoretical design. So I think these are things that people should be aware of. And plus, really, Wang Huning has more urgent tasks to do, and that is repairing and finding out ways to redesign the CCP's governing legitimacy. If we remember from 20th Party Congress, one theme they've been talking about for a long time is this sentence, 中国共产党为什么能? Why is it that the CCP can perform and deliver for its people? That's been Xi Jinping's ticket to re-election into his third term. However, that is running into a bit of a challenge right now with China struggling with economic downturn, as well as its previous success in COVID management is now also running into a wall as well. So how does CCP go about repairing the narrative of the superiority of the CCP as a regime, as a government type? I think that's going to be Wang Huning's main task going forward.
Ambassador.
I would like to add up more, some words into the Wang Huning. People in Taiwan tend to exaggerate or enlarge the role or importance of Wang Huning. Maybe given his personal background, he used to be a speech writer and thinker for the past maybe 4 or 5 presidents of China. So that gave him a kind of a higher profile to be in charge of the Taiwan policy of the Chinese Communist Party. But as a matter of fact, I would like to tell the audience that the real only one architect of China's Taiwan policy architect
Xi Jinping.
is Xi Jinping.
Sorry, I stole that
Wang
from
Huning is one of the executors, okay? But not only Wang Huning himself, but also let's not forget Wang Yi. Wang Yi used to be, the Taiwan office director of Chinese Copy. Also, Cai Qi, a new member of the top 7 of the political bureau. The top 7, Politburo. Cai Qi also used to be, in charge of Taiwan's policy within the party machine, okay, in the national security, apparatus of the party itself. So all these people, the kind of, the group, okay, executors for Xi Jinping in terms of mapping out the Taiwan policy. Not only Wang Huning himself.
Okay, so probably the same old ideas. Is our conclusion. Still to come in the show, the United States has determined that some Chinese companies are providing non-lethal assistance to Russia in Ukraine.
What is the United States saying to the Chinese government about this?
So we're closely monitoring the situation as we have been since the war started. We will continue to communicate to China the implications of providing material support to Russia's war against Ukraine.
That was the White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre. But first, let's turn to Western Europe. French President Emmanuel Macron is expected to visit Beijing soon, but it's later than German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who visited in November, and EU President Charles Michel in December 2022. In a Foreign Affairs article this month, Scholz writes, quote, "China's rise does not warrant isolating Beijing or curbing cooperation. But neither does China's growing power justify claims for hegemony. During my recent visit to Beijing, I expressed firm support for the rules-based international order as well as for open and fair trade. I also raised concerns over the growing insecurity in the Taiwan Strait." The words of Olaf Scholz, writing about a watershed moment that he calls the Globen Zeitenwende, his term for the end of an era. He used the term in a speech in February 2022, announcing Germany's increase in defense spending to 2% of GDP from 1.3%, a level that had been in place since World War II. Wen-ti. So we've talked about Australia. Now we're getting to Europe and its relationship with China. What do you make of, Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz coming to visit Beijing? And what do you make of that article that Scholz wrote about the end of an era?
I'll just say that more broadly speaking, what we're going to see out of Europe is likely to be some kind of unity among diversity in how they approach China.
And unity
among diversity. I mean that in terms of a bilateral diplomacy versus multilateral diplomacy difference. We're going to see, of course, the EU has its own Indo-Pacific strategy that came out not too long ago. So on a multilateral level, out of European Commission, out of European Parliament, you are likely to see firmer and firmer stance coming out of the EU as it tried to grow as a unitary and coherent strategic actor, especially in the aftermath of Russia's war on Ukraine. And naturally, that will have some kind of reverberation effect on how they approach China more coherent as well.
So more critical of China as a result of?
Yes, on a multilateral level, I think that's what we're going to see, greater unity and more assertive stance out of Europe. However, on a bilateral level though, China, I think it's doing its own fair share in terms of trying to lure as well to attract European actors to repair ties with China on a more bilateral level. And that's why we're seeing increasing European interest from Germany, from France, and others who have interest in warming a tie with China. And on this, if I may add one more point as well, I think China is trying really hard to woo the non-US part of the West. So from China's new 20th Party Congress's Central Committee, for example, that's their top 200 leaders. Usually the foreign affairs portfolio get 2, maybe 3 in the top 200. This year, however, or rather at the 20th Party Congress last year, they get 5. So that shows you greater weight they pay to foreign affairs. But not only that, 3 of the top 5 all have experience in the greater European affairs portfolio. 2 of them used to work in China's embassy in the UK, and another 2 of them used to be vice foreign ministers responsible for Europe. So just from this personnel arrangement alone, you can see that China is really trying to make building greater alignment with Europe, as well as weakening the cohesion of a US-led Western bloc vis-a-vis China as the centerpiece of China's diplomatic great game going forward.
Ambassador, yeah, this is fascinating, isn't it? Because we've heard about the transatlantic alliance, especially in relation to Ukraine and Russia, and yet, as Wen-ti said, there seems to be, maybe China picking off countries bilaterally, France, Germany, and these countries appear to be sending a signal that they are keen to re-engage with China.
Well, it's a very complex situation now in Europe in terms of the EU and the US relations. And right now, the so-called transatlantic alliance has now turning a little sour, if not in its wane, okay? Because back in the Trump administration time, the US and EU relations has been very turning very, very discouraging. But under Biden administration, although Biden is trying very hard to make up for the relation between the EU and the US, however, the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, and then China was getting involved, and Biden, in the context of his anti-China policy, he's trying to get the EU involved, get EU join the team up with the United States. However, some recent incidents, 2 incidents, 2 major developments, they have turned the EU and China relations into a very interesting pictures. Number one is the beginning of the war in Ukraine. EU members, they're joining the United States.
Absolutely.
In fighting against the Russians. But as time went by, the war in Ukraine is turning is raging on. It's dragging on. Either way, that China is getting some of the European countries are getting confused. Like as mentioned earlier, that right after the 20th Party Congress of China, the German Chancellor and the EU president, they visited Beijing almost right away, right after the Party Congress.
So what's the confusion?
Confusion. So they're trying to economically. I think the people will not forget that it's a common reality that the EU and China, they are two largest trading partners of each other in the world. So this trend, no matter what happened in the world, this trend is kind of irreversible. So in short, that economically, Europe and China, they're kind of complementary to each other's interests. Okay. But in terms of the security or militarily, the EU cannot forget the American pressure, obviously. So kind of the EU trying to differentiate, okay, for their own interest's sake. They try and differentiate the security interests from the U.S. and economic interests from China. And the China, of course, in this kind of a context, they're trying to take advantage of certain individual European countries. In addition to the EU president's visit or Chancellor of German Chancellor, Michel visit, okay, the Scholz visit. Don't forget the Xi Jinping. The rumor had it that Xi Jinping is going to visit the UK later this year. So this is kind of a European aggressive, Euro offensive. Okay, Euro, return for China. It's going to continue. Obviously, there's going to not be a kind of eyesore. It's going to be eyesore to Biden, Mr. Biden. However, but still, some of the incidents that doesn't mean that encouraging for the EU-China relations. I think
still being cautious.
They're still being cautious. Yeah. I think it's a kind of let one recent example. Okay, tell you the story that the Netherlands, the Dutch, the Dutch chips major manufacturer ASML. ASML used to be against the U.S. policy in terms of the chips export control measure to China. Yeah. But now they kind of relax. They like to join. I think the ASML has just only yesterday or so, if I'm not mistaken, they agreed to join the U.S. and Japan for this kind of chips export control against China. So. Of course, let alone that, if we talk about Taiwan, I think the Czech Republic, the new president-elect, yesterday, he made an unusual phone call with President Tsai Ing-wen, expressing his support. I think that would be a very kind of a very it's a painful incident. It's related to China.
Yeah, Wen-ti, so is it, as Ambassador said, is quite clear cut? Europeans, for their security, want to ally with the US, for the economy, they want to ally with China? Or is there kind of like this very muddling, mixed messages actually that's coming out of Europe right now? Is it trying to find its feet? Is it because we saw the shift away from China, that was quite distinct, being more critical of China? Now are we, in reaction to that? Or is it that, certain European leaders like Scholz never actually abandoned their desire to engage economically with China, and that they might, be more sympathetic when China might say things like, "We don't want preconditions," "We don't want you to set preconditions." Like how successful can China be in trying to drive a wedge between Europe and the US when it's saying things like, no preconditions? So don't try to tell us to respect human rights, that sort of thing. How successful do you think they can be?
Well, I think they are still in a very early exploratory stage at this moment in terms of how Europe finds its place, its optimal position, if you will, in this spectrum with US on the one end and China on the other. And for them, obviously, they feel like US still is as strong as ever when it comes to a commitment to like-minded democracies, as we've seen from how they support Ukraine, as we see on how U.S. moving towards not complete, but increasingly more layers of strategic clarity, or almost clarity, if you will, on Taiwan issue. So I think on that, there's definitely faith in the U.S. picking up with this new administration. However, on economy, there is also a sense that Europe has to find its own place in the world, and the way to do that is to make sure that they find all the avenue they can in terms of increasing their own capability and economic vitality Again, I think the Russia-Ukraine war is a galvanizing event as well that shows how fragile supply chains can be, how Europe-dependent Europe can be in terms of imports of energy, imports of other critical goods that's critical to the economy.
But it's also an event that highlighted how important values are between democracies, right?
Indeed, I think so, definitely. So that's why you see even in countries like Scandinavia, for example, that historically would be a lot more alert to join any binding multilateral security agreements, actually lining up, actually expressing strong interest in finding the way into joining the NATO alliance as well. These are things that used to be very unthinkable, but at this point, the important values seem to be something that if they absolutely have to choose between security and economy, then let's go back to that old line by Joseph Nye back in the 1990s, and that is, security is like oxygen. You only realize you don't have it, you only realize how important it is when you don't have it anymore. So Europe is realizing how important it is after Ukraine.
Coming up, the growing Japan-US security alliance is about making sure the US-led order in Asia survives, according to Sean King.
So if South Korea were to fall to North Korea, that's terrible, but I think it would be basically limited to the Korean Peninsula. If Taiwan were to ever be seized by the PRC, it would basically signal the end of the US order in Asia, to which Japan has hitched its ride, either because we chose not to fight or we fought and lost. Either way, Japan's in a bad way.
Now, we'd like to know what you think will be in China's plan to replace the one country, two systems model. And you can leave your comments in the YouTube comment section just below. But first, let's turn to the Ukraine war and look at whether China's controversial friendship with Russia is impacting its foreign policy and its credibility as a global power. The US has unveiled new sanctions against Moscow, but also targeted a Chinese company that allegedly provided satellite imagery to Russian paramilitary group Wagner to enable their combat operations in Ukraine. The United States has confronted Beijing over the allegations. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General is in Seoul, calling for South Korea to send arms to Ukraine. He had this to say on China.
We believe that we should engage with China on issues like arms control, climate change and other issues. But at the same time, we are very clear that China poses a challenge to our values, to our interests and to our security.
Ambassador, if I can come to you. So we've covered off Australia, Europe, and we can't ignore the biggest foreign policy relationship for China, which is Russia, and its position over the Ukraine war. Because up until now, there didn't seem to be significant evidence of Beijing directly supporting Russia, but now the United States has said that there have been examples of private companies, a private satellite imaging company that is sending its imagery to help the Wagner paramilitary group. So how much credibility, in your view, has China lost over its position in Ukraine, over its friendship with Russia?
Well, I'd like to point out that the term, it's funny you should mention the credibility. This term, this name, it's hardly the middle name of China. We're not talking about the Chinese credibility. There's no such things. Well, I'd like to make points for this question. Firstly, I think China, as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned, China is standing not to their liking, obviously. They is not standing in a very awkward predicament between Russia and Ukraine. At the beginning, I think that China is trying to stand by Russia, in many respects. But as the war, keeps dragging on or is raging out, so I think China is, as you know, that some Western leaders, such as the French, President Macron, I think he's one of the major or one of the active lobbyists trying to convince China to mediate into the war. But China has not agreed to do that. Xi Jinping has not nod his head to do that. So China is trying to figure out, because China it's not going to help. It's not going to, as strongly as it used to stand by the Russian side in this war. Because Ukraine, I think this is caused some international controversies. So China has to be very careful, particularly at this moment when China is trying to come back for the diplomatic, like
homecoming.
That's right, kind of homecoming and peaceful. Me to do that. They would not, hesitate not to do that. They want to get involved. The number one. Number two, about the private companies, some of the private companies of China getting involved in some of the sensitive weapons.
Do you think the Chinese government knows about this?
I'm not sure that. I'm not saying that they don't. Okay, but I think they do. They do. But that's for international. Some of the Chinese companies, they're crossing everywhere, scattering around in the whole world. It's not possible for the Chinese government, for Beijing central government to control each of the thousands or the millions of the Chinese companies, worldwide.
Yet when it wants to.
But even if it wants to,
it does, doesn't it?
That's right. Theoretically,
when it wants to crack down on the companies.
Theoretically, it sounds like China is a central control economy. They can control everything, can do everyone. Well, it's not that perfect.
Right.
Okay. Although China, really wants to do so.
So you don't think that they're sort of testing the limits of the policy of the sanctions?
Well,
they're trying to keep pushing the boundaries.
As a Chinese saying goes, that with one eye open and one eye closed to see what will happen. They'll be selective in picking the points to their interest. So I think this, let alone that the business transaction worldwide is closely, it's a very complex and also intertwined with each other. It's not easy to pick up a single one. Okay, you can trace. It's not easy to trace back, where it goes from and where it goes, where it's going. So I think this is a very, very. I think this question will keep going, and let alone I think I mentioned the Dutch SML. Our SML has announced that they're going to stop the export to China. Still, some of the SML made products have been discovered in the Chinese companies. So I think that's one of the examples. But SML, the CEO of SML said that we cannot control the past, the outgoing for the products.
Wen-ti, I want to sort of pick up on something that I had raised, and Ambassador had a very interesting response saying that China has no credibility. But I just want to return to this because China likes to say that it abides by the principles of sovereign territory. So this is the central, controversy, isn't it, over Ukraine, where Russia invaded Ukraine's sovereign territory, and yet China won't condemn Russia, right? So how, given that, as Ambassador mentioned, now China wants to do this reset, however, they might want to mask it, but they're appearance-wise, they want to do this. They want to re-engage with the world. So how much of a factor is its position with Russia in the Ukraine war going to be a stumbling block?
It's going to be a major factor for sure. I mean, like we discussed, Ukraine war and really Russian aggression was that galvanizing factor that really sealed the cohesion of the Western Bloc, largely speaking, especially EU. So I think on that issue, China's waffling attitude, if you will, or a lack of clarity at minimum, is going to be a major risk factor in any Chinese attempt to re-engage the EU. And I think Ambassador was definitely correct in saying how the Chinese private companies' action in Ukraine/Russia, there's always going to be room for ambiguity there because Chinese government could either direct the company to go there, or they could encourage it, they could nudge it, or at minimum permit it without actively blocking it. There's so many layers of possibility there, and perhaps possible that China want to find some kind of wiggle room to help out its friend Russia without actively, so publicly and directly annoying the Europeans at the same time.
But there's so much at stake. There's so much at stake at the moment, isn't there?
Indeed, I think China is really walking a very fine tightrope there. And really, I'm not that surprised if China does try to support Russia in some way of the war. If you remember a few months ago, Li Zhanshu, who is the Speaker of China's Parliament, the NPC, National People's Congress, He actually went to this, if I remember correctly, the Russian Far Eastern Economic Forum and met with Putin. And during that very high-profile meeting, he said something to the effect of that he thinks Russians' actions in Ukraine are legitimate, and that China will provide some level, quote-unquote, support. And so I'm not all that surprised if they actually deliver to some level, to what they may see as optimal level of support that is enough so that they feel like they're being a good friend to Russia, but not so high a level of support as to actively annoy the Europeans. Whether that kind of balance is possible, though, in this era, I think it's very questionable, and China better think twice about how much political capital they want to spend on that, especially when they try to engage Europe.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador and Wen-ti. Now, Japan is set to take a predominant role on the global stage as it takes the presidency of G7 and assumes its non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council. To find out how this will play out in Japan's strengthened security alliance with the US, I speak with Sean King in our extended interview. Sean King is Park Strategy's Senior Vice President and an affiliated scholar at University of Notre Dame's Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Affairs. He was also a recent visiting fellow to S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies and a former US Department of Commerce Senior Advisor for Asia. Let's take a look.
Fumio Kishida and Joe Biden met at a historic time in US-Japan ties as they build it, and at a time when those ties have never been closer. Is China the reason why?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, Japan's really come into its own ever since the United States unfortunately left the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Japan took leadership of it. It's really assumed much more of a leadership role within free Asia. And now we see as the PRC threat emerges and grows, and Japan worries we may not be there forever, although we're not leaving Asia anytime soon, we being the United States. It's decided to somewhat take matters into its own hand and effectively double its defense spending in its latest budget, from 1% to 2%, coming close to the NATO threshold of 2% of GDP on defense. So North Korea is an issue, some other things, but really the PRC, a potential attack on Taiwan, or a seizure of the Senkaku Islands, which inconveniently Taipei itself claims, the real reasons. Mainland China is behind Japan's reason for its increase in its defense budget, no doubt.
Kishida has framed this point in time, which he's saying is a significant change in the US-Japan relationship.
I don't really see it so much as a change. I see it more of an evolution. I think Japan's taking more responsibility. It wants to not be seen as a free rider, as some US allies are accused. And the alliance itself is also evolving and adapting. When the defense and foreign ministers met in the 2+2 meetings on Thursday, they discussed things like cyber, outer space, and also a more mobile and nimble US forces in Japan, especially around southern islands of Japan, which would be nearer any Taiwan contingency should it ever come to pass. So I really see it as an evolution and an adaptation and growth of the alliance and the relationship between the two countries.
And what did Kishida want to achieve from this trip, and did he achieve it?
Well, I'll start with the end. He definitely achieved it. And the Japanese public is pretty much on board with the increase in defense armaments, an increase and a tougher line on Beijing. The question is, how are you going to pay for it? And he has proposed to pay for it with tax money. And I don't know if that's going to go over so well. So I think he wants to show that the US is behind him on this, and standing in Washington counts for a lot back in Japan with the public, members of the Diet, and voters. So the fact that Joe Biden is strongly behind Kishida on his bold plans and stands with it and endorses it will help him sell the plan at home and get the money for it. And remember, Kishida's popularity is down due to his party's connection with the Unification Church in the wake of the late Shinzo Abe's assassination.
How does Taiwan play into that?
Well, they see the PRC increasing its defense, North Korea shooting off missiles every day or so. And again, as we saw during the Trump years, there could always be the suspicion that Japan's not pulling its weight among certain Americans. So the more they can do to show that they are doing everything they can, just like Taiwan increasing its conscription to 1 year is going to help sell the Taiwan case in Washington, I think just makes Japan even a more sympathetic case than it already is in Washington. And Taiwan, if South Korea were to fall to North Korea, that's terrible. But I think it would be basically limited to the Korean Peninsula. If Taiwan were to ever be seized by the PRC, it would basically signal the end of the U.S. order in Asia, to which Japan has hitched its ride. So if Taiwan were to fall to the PRC, it would mean the end of the U.S. in Asia, either because we chose not to fight or we fought and lost. Either way, Japan's in a bad way. Plus, again, the PRC's attempts to interfere with and seize the Senkaku Islands. So Japan has a lot more at stake when it comes to the PRC than when, say, it has on the Korean Peninsula.
That would be why Biden is insistent on building alliances. Japan is too. The Washington meeting capped a tour to G7 leaders. How important is it for Japan to seek allies beyond the US? How do you think G7 would be shaped under Japan's leadership this year?
Well, again, when we're talking about a potential end to the U.S. order in Asia, I don't see this happening anytime soon. I do not foresee an imminent invasion of Taiwan. I've been worried about Taiwan's status for 25 years. I'm thinking medium to long term, and I do applaud President Biden for working as much as possible through alliances, force multipliers for good and U.S. values in the region. And Japan, as leader of the G7 this year, Japan has to go around working with these other nations. And I know on this tour of the world, Kishida stopped in every G7 country except Germany. And I think with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, autocracy, terror, and invasion and terrible things cannot be localized anymore. It's a global issue. So by focusing on what Russia's doing in Ukraine, I think Kishida can help Europeans understand the plight that certain East Asian democracies like Japan face against mainland China and North Korea. And under Japan's leadership, I think that the G7 will be very focused on democracy, the rights of smaller state, maritime issues, and cast a very careful, skeptical eye on both Beijing and Pyongyang, perhaps more so than if it were under any European powers jurisdiction this year.
Along with mentioning peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, the joint statement between Kishida and Joe Biden also mentioned the strengthening the trilateral security partnership with South Korea. How important is South Korea to security in Asia?
Very important. It's a leading democracy and major economy. And South Korean conservatives tend to favor Japan, and South Korean liberals tend to pull away from Japan. So Yoon Suk-yeol, the incumbent South Korean conservative president, ran on a platform of closer cooperation with Japan. Already there have been naval reviews, talk of intelligence sharing, and none of the Japan bashing in his government you've seen in previous administrations. I don't think South Korea would directly involve itself in any kind of Taiwan contingency, but as we saw in Yoon's